For over 10 years, we at Climate One have been engaging policymakers, influencers, entrepreneurs, and activists and scientists in broad, respectful, candid conversations about everything climate. Food, energy, water, technology, transportation, housing. We've had huge success bringing together people who think they're on opposite sides of issues. When they sit down and have a candid conversation, they often find common ground and the basis for real solutions. We're emotional beings. Thoughtful, inclusive conversations create the conditions in which the changes we want to see become possible. So I want to hear from you. When you talk about climate, how do you talk about it? More importantly, what do you want to be talking about? With whom? Join the conversation. Even make your own video. Invite your friends to join you. Let's talk climate. I'm Greg Dalton, host of Climate One from the Commonwealth Club. Thanks for joining us to talk about climate. This program is part of the Commonwealth Club's virtual series addressing the many impacts of COVID-19 on our community and country. It is supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and a collaborative of local funders and donors. We're grateful for their support and hope others will follow their example and support the club's role as a public square while we can't convene in person. I'm pleased to convene with you here now for this live stream on the economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. Your participation is a vital part of this experience, so please share your questions in the comment section on the live stream, or you can tweet them to us using our handle @ClimateOne. We'll use as many as we can during today's show. For future Climate One discussions on coronavirus, economic disruption, human response, and climate change, sign up for our newsletter at climateone.org. You can also subscribe to our weekly podcast that drops every Friday and is available wherever you get your pods. The economic collapse has shattered many records and is still unfolding. Everyone wants to know how deep and how long it will be. What does it mean for the battle against climate change? We're pleased to explore COVID and the economy with three experts. Kathleen Day is finance lecturer at Johns Hopkins University and author of the recent book, Broken Bargain, Banks, Bailouts, and the Struggle to Tame Wall Street. Amy Jaffe is director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And Matt Rogers is a senior partner at McKinsey Company and co-author of the recent report, Addressing Climate in a Post-Pandemic World. Welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us from the comfort of your home.
Thank you. I'm sick of my home.
Kathleen Day, let's begin with a historic look. You have studied many economic crises over the 20th and 21st century. How does this crisis, the unemployment rate, how does this compare to other economic disasters that we've seen?
Unfortunately, the numbers of this crisis compared to the Depression of the 1930s, even though the causes of this are very different and very different than every economic crisis is unique, but it also shares some components. One, of course, is it usually engenders some unemployment. So unemployment during the 1930s reached 25%. Now, remember, they didn't keep numbers as well as we do now, but still 25% is what people accept now. And now into the crisis of 2009 to 2012 was about 10% around the country, average, even though some pockets got into the teens. We are already into the teens. In the last 3 weeks, up to 17 million people lost their jobs. And I've heard estimates from 13 to 15%. Some people think that's undercounting. And some estimates say it will exceed the 25%. But at any rate, it's a lot, and it's swift and big. And that's what is remarkable about it.
And we'll talk a little more about that later. Amy Jaffe, you're an economic modeler. It went down fast. People are hoping it can come back fast also. Do we know what the shape, the V shape or all these other shapes out there about when we're going to come back and how fast? Do we know?
Well, I like to have two historical references that come from the oil market, and I think they're both important. After September 11, Americans inside the United States stopped flying for a period of time, and actually, we did not go back to normal domestic travel until 2004. So that can give you an idea of the challenge that we face getting people back out and circulating and in airplanes again, because this is actually probably less irrational than the way people felt after a terrorist attack, which is what are the chances you're going to have every week, a terrorist attack in the airport? That was very low probability. So the second one I like to tell is what happened after SARS in China. In China, SARS hit in the end of 2002, and Chinese citizens in Beijing and other big cities became afraid to use public transportation. And so car sales in 2003 in China were up 30%. So you do get these responses, and then they sort of lay themselves out over time, and it's not quite as I think the downturn can be very sudden, and I think the recovery is more gradual than maybe people are thinking.
Matt Rogers, your view on McKinsey, sort of, how quickly we'll bounce back, or this going to be a slow, uncertain climb out? It seems like timeframes keep getting extended. We first thought this was weeks, and now it's months, and now we're hearing, well, maybe 18 months till there's a vaccine.
Yeah, we've laid out a series of scenarios with the McKinsey Global Institute that range from a restoration of the economy in Q2 of 2021 to Q4 of 2024. I mean, it depends really on how long we stay down, because we're down much, as Kathleen was talking about, we're down much further, I think, than anybody expected. And there are certain parts of the economy that are going to really struggle to come back. Amy hit on the oil markets as one of those examples.
And Amy, Jaffe, there was an oil price war before this between Russia and Saudi Arabia. What's that about? And isn't low, cheap energy good for American consumers who are pinched right now? They're not driving, but isn't generally cheap energy is good for the economy?
Well, typically, cheap energy is considered sort of like a stimulus. And the way that functions, it's also, if you're a household, you're spending less on fuel and you're spending less on travel, and it stimulates people to travel. And then the flip side is for businesses, I'm not having as high an energy cost, so I can hire more people and support my business and the economy that way. The problem is, because of the pandemic, we're not seeing a lot of those responses. It's not really serving as a stimulus in the same way. People are not likely to take a driving vacation from Memorial Day weekend unless something really changes in terms of the pandemic. And I think it's going to be a while before people are back to the airports. So some of these traditional things that boost the economy when energy prices are low is going to be much harder this time to actually get that boost effect.
Matt Rogers, the U.S. is in a different situation energy-wise than in previous crises, because the U.S. has the domestic supply, domestic production has grown so much lately. We're basically kind of net neutral, at least the numbers I looked at 19, the amount of oil that the U.S. exports and imports is about the same. So how does that affect our position right now? We're not vulnerable to international energy markets, but we own more of it ourselves domestically because we pursued this energy independence under both Obama and Trump.
Yeah, the challenge, the good news for the U.S. is we have 100,000 plus people employed in the oil and gas sector in the U.S., and the challenge is that is now under attack. And I think the question is, how will employment hold up in that sector, an enormously important part of the U.S. economy. And we're in a situation where on the other side of the equation, we have, as Amy was saying, gasoline demand is down almost 50%, jet fuel demand down 65%. So it's really hard to get a stimulus benefit when you're actually not using the product. And so I think we have a real challenge. Refinery runs in the U.S. in the second week in April went down 1 million barrels a day. But actual production in the U.S. actually only went down about 100,000 barrels a day. So we have a real imbalance with supply. Although rig counts went down in 6 weeks, 25%. It took 24 weeks in the last oil downturn to come down that many. So the supply side is trying to adjust, but it is going to be a very difficult adjustment. We hit the brakes on the economy very hard, very fast. And we don't yet have the flexibility to adjust the industrial systems in the oil and gas sector at the same rate.
Kathleen Day, what are some lessons from past crises in terms of what works pulling America out of a recession? Of course, it depends on what put it in the first place. But what are some lessons from history? Right?
Yeah, one thing is debt. And one of the lessons that we learned the hard way in the last crisis is that it wasn't that people needed more credit, they needed less debt. So the stimulus package now, if you give people a check, then they spend it, they don't need one check, they need a continuous source of income that they with which they can use to pay their groceries and their rent. So I use this example of one of my local pizza places here in DC. The owners made a decision to close so that their employees could go on unemployment. That gives them a regular check. Those people will be better off than waiting for a $1,200 one-time stimulus. So many people in this country, this crisis would be bad no matter what economically, but it has served to expose some of the vulnerabilities of the economy anyway. And one of those is that we have such a large number of people living from check to check. So any economic dislocation reverberates many times more with that group than with people who can work from home and continue to get a paycheck. So there's other spots that are vulnerable, but how quickly we'll recover, people are going to be dying to get out of their house, to get haircuts, to go and see people again, to go to work. We may never bring the handshake back the way it was. Maybe people will forever use fewer paper towels. I know I will. But I think transportation, maybe not. But I don't think there's going to be the fear of flying the way there was after the terrorist attack. But what I'm hoping is the residual effect of this will be maybe to make people believe maybe this pandemic has something to do with climate. Maybe in any case, maybe we should take science more seriously and not dismiss it. And maybe some of those 100,000 people who are employed in fossil fuels could be better deployed in renewable energy and in helping the infrastructure. So I'm hoping there's going to be some more thought about how to bolster the economy long term and not just look for quick fixes from cheap energy.
Matt Rogers, you flew a lot shortly after 2001, 9/11, and got patted down, I don't know, 500 times in a year. You said you have a different view on how quickly flying will come back. Will people be comfortable sitting next to someone who is worried about every cough and sneeze on a plane?
Yeah, I fly every week of the year. After 9/11, I got patted down, at least 4 or 5 times a week. And I want to get on an airplane and know that the person sitting next to me is actually COVID free. And I think the question is, how do we certify that? We certified in 2001 through pat downs. How do we certify that, in fact, my traveling companion is safe to fly? And again, I'm doing 500,000 miles a year on a normal basis, and this is my 40th day on lockdown. Usually after the 40, after the 40 days, you usually get to go out again, and I don't see myself getting on an airplane very soon.
Oh, interesting.
So, Amy, Jaffe, that has profound impacts for the airline industry and all the fuel that goes into it. We've already got too much airline fuel sitting around everywhere.
Well, not to be too technical, but, one of the problems we face that I think a lot of the listeners might not be aware of, when you put crude oil through a refining process, you get each product. It's very hard to get only diesel fuel. We need to have e-commerce deliveries and not get the jet fuel or not get gasoline or marine fuel. So one of the problems we have, especially here in the United States, but also somewhat globally, but definitely here in the United States, is we're running out of places to put all this jet fuel that we don't need. And that can cause tremendous logistical problems because we need a certain amount of diesel fuel to move goods around. And if we run out of storage, it's going to be very challenging logistically to keep the fuel system humming. And so I do think that's something that companies have brought to the attention of the White House. There's some companies that are looking to put jet fuel on ships and just float the ships around. People are thinking about what kind of storage facilities players might have that could be cleaned out and used just for jet fuel. Because, we all saw the news reports about dairy farmers dumping their milk somewhere. But, you can't do anything like that with oil. There's no dumping it. So you either have to stop producing it, and then you have to worry about what kind of dislocations that is going to cause, as we need one part of the barrel, as we call it in the industry, and not another.
Well, a lot of climate people would say, given the carbon budget, we only have 10, or the McKinsey says maybe up to 20 years left of carbon to burn at current rates. Amy, Jaffe, why doesn't we leave that oil in the ground rather than trying to refine it and store it in different places? We need to keep some of that carbon in the ground if we're going to meet the Paris goals and stabilize the climate.
Well, we have a really unusual opportunity now to reevaluate when we need to transport ourselves and when we don't. And we have a tremendous opportunity. I mean, we're doing the show now, over video and taping, and we don't all have to be in the same studio with you. And we're now realizing that technology is pretty strong. So, but we're also social beings. So the question is really going to be, do we have the political will to make good choices about when we're going to use transportation fuel and when we're not? And I think I feel a little bit more optimistic because we have a lot of technology that can be thrown at this. We've got, automated vehicles coming. We've got, delivery robots and delivery drones. So the question is, how can we organize when we come out of the pandemic to be more carbon efficient? And we need to do that, and that will definitely keep oil under the ground. The question is, though, what do we do about the automobile system? We have 271 million vehicles on the road today in the United States, and only 1 million of them are electric. And the transition to go from having half of them be electric, as you know, from California, has had a tremendously difficult time getting the population, which is highly committed to doing something about climate change. It's still been virtually impossible to get people in electric cars. So the question is, how are we going to move that forward? How are we going to stay out of our automobiles, especially if people are afraid to use public transportation for a period of time? That is really the critical challenge. And to me, it's going to be a combination of increased use of digital. Maybe we don't all have to commute to the office every single day. Maybe we don't all have to commute to the office at 7 o'clock in the morning, causing tremendous traffic around the Bay Area. Maybe people could stagger when they go in for in-person meetings. So we have a lot of flexibility to work on this problem, but we must work on the problem from the demand side. When we work on the problem from just curtailing supply, all you do is create tremendous dislocation. We need to work on the problem from the demand side.
Don't you think that many employers are beginning to say maybe we don't need to have everyone fly out across the country for a 15-minute meeting? I know in real estate, I've heard some company owners say, maybe we've invested too much in storefront property. Yes, we are social beings and our employees do like to get together, but they could work from home more than they have been. It's worked really well. So maybe we don't have to rent as much storefront property. By the same token, maybe we don't all have to go in person to the meetings we've been going to.
And that's a big thing especially for international travel, which the Europeans, being very carbon sensitive, were already trying to reduce jet travel. So the real question for retail is this sort of new thing where we use big data. And, could we have pop-up stores that come in neighborhoods where people buy particular things and then in particular times of year, and then those stores disappear and something else that's important comes up.
The Malamar store.
Right. And so this way we're utilizing more walking and we're using retail space more efficiently, again, to prevent people. And one of the interesting studies that's been done by MIT and the UC shows that actually, unless you're insisting on having your 1 hour delivery, if you really actually were to use e-commerce and you're relaxed about when you get your package, because all these transportation companies use algorithms that make it efficient so that they're bringing all the packages to your neighbors at the same time, and it's all done by computer, that is a lot less carbon intensive actually than each one of us driving to each store we're going to go to alone in a vehicle. So, and Matt's firm has done a tremendous amount of work on this and has calculated, McKinsey's calculated, that we could save up to 25% of all the oil used in freight on road just by using these computer big data programs.
Matt Rogers, we have a question from YouTube. Can we take the mortal fear we have of COVID-19 with 3 billion people worldwide sheltering in place? And bring this fear and action to the far larger long-term problem of our climate emergency. And another one from Catherine on YouTube, we've changed our behavior so fast around COVID. How can we apply that to climate? Matt Rogers.
Yeah. No, and I think that in the near term, we're all focused on defeating the virus, but business leaders are now beginning to figure out how do we come back. And our view is quite clearly that we can come back both cleaner and, importantly, more resilient. I think there's a set of important lessons learned for climate from this COVID tragedy, and because this is a physical shock to the system, much as climate is a physical shock to the system, and that kind of physical shock, unlike the financial shock, isn't just about rebuilding confidence. It's about rebuilding infrastructure and thinking differently about how we build infrastructure. It's a systematic problem. So you have a problem in one sector that infects another sector. So we see demand decline in the oil sector, and that leads to a price war. By the way, we're going to see demand decline over a long-term basis in the energy sectors as a result of the energy transition underway. And we have 50 years of supply. So 50 years of supply meets declining demand. What do we get? We end up getting, we're more inclined to get price wars, and that ends up being part of the story. The other thing that I think is important is this is a non-linear. The pandemic is nonlinear and climate is nonlinear. We now have all gotten to the point we understand, let's keep the curve below the capacity in hospitals. Much the same is true in climate. If we get above a certain level, all of a sudden there are much larger effects that we actually don't control. We sort of always have this image that we're always in control. What we've realized is we're actually in control in a narrow band of reality. And if we break outside of that narrow band, whether it's in the financial markets or the oil markets or in climate, all of a sudden we are not in control in the way that we thought we could. And the cost of remediation after we lose control is way higher than the cost of prevention today. I mean, we did a look at just the utilities in the US, and you look at storm damage, and it is far cheaper to invest in preventative measures against hurricanes and flooding than it is to repair it after it's done. And yet there's a tendency to underinvest in resilience across the economy. And I think one of the big lessons learned is how do we've fine-tuned this, and Kathleen was talking about this earlier, we fine-tuned this so much for efficiency, but we actually need resilience much more than we give credit for in the physical system and in the economic system. And so, again, we have a real opportunity as we come out. One of the amazing things is, we are going to be at a point where carbon emissions in the US may be as much as 20% down this year because of the economic challenge. And so then the question is, as we come back, what assets do we bring back? And how do we think about what that rebuild, can we rebuild better than in fact when we went down? And I think that's the opportunity.
I hope that people can be as rational as that. But, and I know this is not about healthcare, but healthcare is a great example where it's always cheaper to treat people before they get to the emergency room. Business has been arguing that, and yet we cannot get to a universal health system that would be cheaper for everybody if everyone were in it. So I worry that people's short-term economic interests cloud the longer-term viability for all of us. So I hope you're all right, that you are all correct. I hope you are all correct that people will use this as a moment to become more rational. I also think of the recycling movement. People, I know recycling is not perfect, and I know there's been problems with it, including municipalities that it turns out they aren't recycling. They say they are, and they're not. But the fact is, Americans were much more willing and able, and in fact did much more recycling much quicker than anyone expected. So I'm holding on to that model, hoping that that's true with energy consumption and changing behavior post this virus.
Shubhayu Saha is a health scientist at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. He was part of a CDC team that developed a process for local health officials known as BRACE, or Building Resilience Against Climate Effects, that connects the economy, climate, and human health.
There is, quite a bit of literature and evidence out there which, links fluctuations in temperature and precipitation and humidity to the spread of infectious diseases. We are seeing it in places where we haven't seen it before. In many places, there's a resurgence of some of these diseases that hadn't happened over a period of time. So it is definitely a huge global concern. It is important for us to, not only estimate what the epidemiologic burden is associated with these events, as well as what the economic analogs are. What was the healthcare costs associated with a particular heat wave? What were the healthcare costs associated with an extreme flooding event? Things like that. Because, as we, work with policymakers, if we are to provide economic estimates along with estimates around health impacts, they seem to resonate a lot better. Economics also comes into play when we are thinking about interventions. We work in a resource-constrained environment, and for us to have a sense of not only what interventions are effective, but the ones that are cost-effective, more public health practitioners at the community level, at the county and the state level would benefit from that information. So individuals are being impacted in ways that we hadn't foreseen. The situation is imposing, strain and stress on people that we haven't seen before. And so, as the summer rolls in, as it becomes extremely hot, people who have already been suffering economically and socially from the current situation, would become maybe even more vulnerable to these extreme weather events. The stress that, people are going through right now, I'm afraid that some of that would, make a lot of these communities a lot more vulnerable than they would have been, let's say, when the next heat wave comes in.
That was Shubhayu Saha, a health scientist at the CDC. Matt Rogers, your response to the comments there about the connections between health and climate. People often think of climate as smokestacks and tailpipes. They don't necessarily think of human health right away.
Well, and the IPCC was clear on the links between health and climate. The Stanford Wood Institute has also done a whole set of things. And again, whether it's mosquito-borne diseases or whether it's climate change pushing animals out of their natural habitats and closer to human populations, there clearly is a direct link. I think the other link that he highlights that's quite important is climate risk is actually quite regressive. It hits poor communities much harder than it hits rich communities. If you have air conditioning, you're much better able to deal with some of those challenges. If you're in a safe home, you're much better able to deal with it. And I think the regressive nature of both the health issues and the climate issues are actually quite important and undermanaged in terms of the investments that we're willing to make. So I think this is again, if we can learn some lessons from the current crisis, not exacerbate them and prevent the next crisis, at least a little bit, I think that's hope. It gives us a little bit of upside as we go forward.
Kathleen Day, former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci said recently that this COVID crisis is a chance to address the income gap, which has grown in this country. There's been stagnant wages, gains mostly going to the very top of wealth. As Matt just said, climate and COVID are regressive. What examples are there from coming out of other crises where America has addressed the income gap, the wealth gap in this country?
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of great examples, possibly in the 1930s with FDR's programs and ways to provide a safety net, the most famous of which is deposit insurance on the money that you have on deposit in your bank. And believe it or not, FDR was opposed to that, by the way, just to set the record straight. It was the Republicans who favored that. And some Democrats did, but FDR himself thought it would cause some laxity on depositors' part. And in fact, it did. And in the 1980s, the Reagan and Bush administration were able to use deposit insurance to kind of hide the crisis. But anyway, that's a whole other story. So, but there is a whittling away that has been accelerated in the recent 15, 20 years in a diminution, a cutting, a shrinking of the middle class. And we really, that may be okay for people with air conditioners for a while, but the people who make air conditioners, who are you going to sell them to eventually? Who's going to buy them? And in fact, there's a whole new phrase that's appropriate but frightening. It's called the thrift economy, and it's from a consultant to the beverage industry saying, how are you going to sell to people who don't have any money? How are you going to sell to this increasing body of people who live from check to check, the working poor? I would wish that there was some remedy. I'm not hopeful there's going to be one right away, but eventually we're all going to have to think about it, because you can't just sell luxury goods to 1%. Who's going to make them? Who's going to buy? It just doesn't work. So it's something that people really need to think about.
Kathleen Day, another connection. I didn't know that it was Republicans who supported deposit insurance. It kind of makes sense.
Read my book.
That makes sense now that you think about it, because who had deposits to make? But another connection you write about is the pandemic of 1918 and the connection to the 1929 stock market crash. So how was the pandemic linked to the crash of 29?
Well, there were two things. There were a couple things, three main things. So the pandemic was devastating. It was depressing. People were dying. If I have my numbers right, I think it was 675,000 people worldwide. There's a lot of people who died. It was depressing. And then there was World War I. Also, many people died. It was depressing. You go into the 1920s, one of the things that contributed to the go-go mentality, that contributed to the go-go economy, is people trying to forget those two onerous events. And coupled with a third thing, which to me was, I learned, you often learn more when you write a book than anyone will ever learn from it. But one thing I learned is that the United States government sold war bonds for World War I because it was such an unpopular war. And they were trying to get the American public to buy into it. So they sold war bonds in small denominations of $50 to $100 so that more people would buy in. And that was the American public's first experience with securities, really. And they bought these bonds and were paid back. So they had some extra change in their pockets going into the 20s. They wanted to forget the pandemic, forget the war, and it contributed to the boom cycle of the 20s. Now, there were plenty of sectors of the economy, like farming and eventually manufacturing, which in the 1920s were not doing well. But it was masked by the go-go mentality of the stock market and some other industries. But part of it was wanting to forget the pandemic. And that may happen here where people really want to go out and get a haircut and they want to forget the fact that they couldn't for several months. But you want to make sure that people do it in a way that is not crazy. But I don't think that will happen here. That was different. Those were three unique events. First experience with securities, wanting to forget those two bad events. But it did contribute mightily to the 1920 go-go years.
So we might, you don't think we'll have our own roaring 20s. Amy Jaffe, you've also written about that time, about 100 years ago, when the way people got around in this country, we were switching from horses to cars. Actually, tell us about some surprising connection when actually electric mobility was king and something changed to put oil in the driver's seat.
Well, it's a very interesting period of time. As you probably know, a lot of innovators in California and other locations conceive of the idea that we would go to robot electric vehicles and they would be charged in a central way and we'd be able to hail them from our smartphone. And actually, around 1910, like at the peak, there were many, many electric cars on the road, very few gasoline vehicles. And gasoline vehicles had a lot of problems. When we think about gasoline now, the oil industry likes to tell us that it was the winning technology and it's the most dense fuel and electric cars don't make any sense. But actually, it was the opposite. Because when you think about it, even today, how often are you going to go more than 30 miles an hour in a city? So in big cities like New York City, people who got around by vehicles called their local taxi company and they came and they took you around, especially, wealthy women of a certain class. And then when the car battery would start to get low, the taxi drivers would bring it back to the central depot. They'd take that battery out of the car, put in a fresh battery, and go about their way. And so it's really interesting me because, of course, we're talking about going back to that system. And it's almost as if we literally wasted 100 years. And we're going to go back to the original system we had in cities. And one of the things that happened is even Ford, when he went to mass produce his vehicle, looked at different fuels. And he imagined it as a vehicle for rural communities where, maybe a battery vehicle didn't make as much sense. And he actually was thinking about it as running on ethanol and alcohol fuel. And indeed, his first cars were dual fuel, like we might see with E85 in the Midwest today. And so what actually happened building on what Kathleen said, is that we hit World War I, and the Germans control the railroads in Europe. And the Allies need assistance from the United States. And what do they need the most of? They need trucks to supersede the fact that they don't have access to the railroads to get manpower moved around, soldiers moved around, and equipment moved around. And so the US government uses, like today, something of the equivalent of the War Powers Act to tell Ford and these other companies that they must build trucks for the war effort. And that puts us squarely into a combustion engine platform in these factories for which we never turn back. And it's a shame because now a century's gone by. And now we're trying to make this shift back, at least in urban settings, to electricity, because that can make sense and be easy to do. And we lost this whole time. We could still be on electricity in New York City. And you think about if we were, how easy the carbon transition could have been if we had never moved away from electric vehicles in urban centers.
Quite an interesting story. And anyone who's read Dark Money by Jane Mayer, there's a connection there with the Koch family, which in World War II and actually doing some fossil fuel infrastructure with Germany that kind of contributed to our dependence on fossil fuels. We're talking about climate change and COVID at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Amy Jaffe, Director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations, Matt Rogers, a Senior Partner at McKinsey Company and co-author of Addressing Climate Change in a Post-Pandemic World, and Kathleen Day, Finance Lecturer at Johns Hopkins University and author of Broken Bargain, Banks, Bailouts, and the Struggle to Tame Wall Street. We're going to go to our lightning round now with some quick questions for our three guests, beginning with Matt Rogers on American shoppers. According to Walmart CEO Doug McMillon, week 1 of quarantine was all about soap and hand sanitizer. Week 2 was toilet paper. Weeks 3 and 4 were spiral ham and baking yeast. Matt Rogers, what flew off the store shelves in week 5?
Oh. Well, I was going to say flour had to be go with the baking yeast, had to be the next bite of that, and then maybe it was time to buy fruit again. I'm gonna be wrong, but
hair clippers and hair dye, according to Doug McMillon. Kathleen Day, which group of phone apps have seen over a 60% increase since the quarantine started? Online dating apps, music streaming apps, online therapy apps, or dog walking apps?
Wow. Dating?
Online therapy apps.
Oh, okay.
Kind of makes sense. People having a hard time with the isolation. Amy Jaffe, the IMF predicts the global economy will shrink by what percent this year? 1%, 3%, or more than 10%, according to the IMF World Economic Outlook?
I'm going to say more than 10%, because if they're saying something lower than that, they're wrong.
They actually said 3%, which seemed low to me.
That seems optimistic to me.
It seems low to me. Also for Amy Jaffe, this is true or false. Amy Jaffe, true or false, oil companies frequently deceive the American people?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. I guess I'm going to have to say yes to that one.
True or false, Kathleen Day, the Trump administration's delayed action on coronavirus cost the country a couple of $1 trillion.
I don't know if I can quantify the numerical amount, but it definitely cost money and sickness and probably lives.
True or false, Matt Rogers, COVID and climate are both black swan events?
That's quite clearly neither is a black swan event. Both have been warned about for years, and we have the opportunity to be fully prepared for at least climate if we actually take the scientific advice and the forecasting quite seriously. These are not black swan events. These are things that are well known and risks that we should be prepared for.
True or false, Kathleen Day, the economic crisis has been good for sales of your book on economic crises?
That actually is true, unfortunately. People want to know how is it the same, how it is different. I'm sorry to say, but I am glad people are reading it, because I hope people my intent is to get people to understand these economic events that so affect everyone's pocketbook. This book is intended for mainstream readers to explain to them why we keep having these economic crashes.
True or false, Amy Jaffe, Californians talk a good game on climate, but they could do a lot more to confront it.
Oh, 100%. I know that's going to really upset your listeners. But, the big trick on climate change is to change behavior and lower the use of fossil fuels. And that means getting out of your car. That means not having extreme commute. That means thinking thoughtfully about the size of your home, and other kinds of things. And I think, not to blame Californians, but in the United States in general, I think people are waiting for government to do it for them or a technologist to do it for them.
All right, next one, Amy. This is the lightning round. True or false?
Okay, all right, go ahead. You're right. You're right. I got on my soapbox.
As a former professor in California, also true or false for Amy Jaffe. Oil companies Total and Shell are making serious moves toward cleaner technologies such as batteries and hydrogen. True or false?
They are. They are making big investments, and the more billions of dollars that come in, the better.
Also for Amy, true or false, ExxonMobil's moves away from fossil fuels are all BS.
Well, I'd say there are things they're doing that would work, like carbon sequestration, and I guess they've made some investments in algae. But compared to their peers, like Shell and BP and Total and the Italian and Spanish companies, they are way behind.
This is a numerical single number. Matt Rogers, a maximum number of days you've gone without a shave while staying at home.
2.
Pretty good. Well grouped there. Kathleen Day, number of times your online classes have been Zoom bombed.
0.
Lucky you.
We're pretty. Mine's an online class that was meant to be online. So we were not. I'm sure there have been some, but I have been lucky.
Amy Jaffe, number of days of food you have in your home right now.
Oh, I'm a logistics person who studies logistics, so I've got like 3 weeks of canned food down in the basement in case something goes wrong with the fuel supply.
Amy's a prepper. Okay, first thing, this is association that comes to mind. First thing that comes to mind, unfiltered, Kathleen Day. When I say, what comes to mind, unfiltered, first thing that pops in your mind, Kathleen Day, when I say the group of corporate leaders known as the Business Roundtable.
Let's get all the benefits of the from taxpayers and not have any oversight.
Matt Rogers.
That's what they want.
Matt Rogers, first thing that comes to mind when I say Fed Chairman Jerome Powell.
Acted very fast at a massive scale.
Also, Matt Rogers, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say the phrase tragedy of the horizon?
The event horizon, this is obviously from Mark Carney, the Bank of England governor, who basically was saying all of a sudden, if we actually take resiliency into account, we'll actually plan against events that might be more than a year out or 2 years out. And we need an event horizon that allows us to make investments in real resiliency. And we need to take advantage of time as our friend to reduce emissions today. And I think that is a really important idea.
Making time of our friend. Kathleen Day, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say Paul Volcker?
A wise and sage person who I will miss, and the financial world is going to miss. He was the honest broker. Everyone trusted him, even if they didn't like what he said. They believed him, and he had a great track record. He was a wonderful person and so smart.
Yeah, real honorable public servant from Reagan administration through.
Absolutely. And towards the end of his life was really trying to push against this idea that everything having to do with the government is bad, which is obviously ridiculous. We need government sometimes. What we need is good government. That's what he was pushing for.
Last one for the lightning round here at Climate One. Amy Jaffe, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I mention the man in your community who held a 40th birthday bash after the coronavirus became a public health emergency? Do we have Amy? Okay. Amy, I'll say that again if you heard me. And the first thing Amy, what comes to mind when that comes to mind? Oops, can't hear me. We'll move on from there. That ends our lightning round. We're going to go to a question from YouTube. David Stevens, economically speaking, how practical would it be to use our economic situation to implement the Green New Deal, or at least investments in sustainable energy? And another question we have about the economy being so economically saddled, Matt Rogers, after this COVID crisis, will there be any money left for green infrastructure or a Green New Deal?
I think the thing that should make us optimistic is we have interest rates close to zero and the opportunity to make significant investments at very low cost in cleaner technologies and in climate resilience is very good. So we have low interest rates. The market is actually starting to price risk appropriately. One of the challenges, and Larry Fink talked about this at some length, was does the market actually price climate risk in? One of the things that we're seeing today is that companies that are involved in renewables are actually proving to be quite resilient, in part because this is something that customers want. Sales of solar that allow you to control what you're doing are actually going up in the current environment because it gives you control. And the market is actually starting to price risk. So these companies are actually turning out to be quite resilient in a very difficult market environment. And so I think the idea that we can get low interest rates and adequate risk pricing should allow us to do the kind of capital formation that we need to do in order to both build back from a resilient standpoint and build back from a cleaner standpoint. The opportunity to build back better is actually quite available today.
And what's the cost of not doing it? That's a cost too.
Though the solar industries said they're concerned about losing half of the 150,000 jobs in solar. Melissa Lott, Amy Jaffe, someone you referred me to at Columbia, says that the outbreak is introducing doubt into the renewable energy global supply chain. So can we afford to go green after this? And will renewables be hurt?
Well, I think that particularly the rooftop sector has seen a slowdown, and there has been these disruptions for panel manufacturing. One would hope that would get resolved pretty quickly now that Chinese factories and others are coming back to work. But I do think that what we're going to see, and we've already seen an initiative like that in Europe, and it'll be part of Europe's recovery, is unfortunately countries are going to now realize if something's important to them and of vital importance like electricity, that they have to have supply chains that are closer to home. Yeah. And I think you're going to see this idea that you're going to rely on one or two suppliers in different locations is over for now. And we're going to have more emphasis on having vital manufacturing in the United States. I think even with the COVID process here, those companies that had 3D printing, there's some innovative companies in California that had 3D printing. Even the oil services company Baker Hughes was using 3D printing for certain kinds of drilling equipment. They've shifted 100% to masks and other pharmaceutical needs for the United States. So I think that we're going to see the use of 3D printing accelerate more than it would have. And I think it's going to be put directly onto these vital needs that we need for basic energy, basic food, bio and health. We're going to see a much bigger emphasis now on how to make those things domestic products made here or in North America. And you're going to see a real change in how global trade takes place.
Matt Rogers, that's quite a fundamental challenging of globalization. Partly sounds a little bit like Donald Trump there, America first.
Well, look, I think this idea of much shorter supply chains is a very important one that we saw this trend happening even before COVID, but I think this just puts a greater emphasis on, because this again gets at the resiliency of the supply base. How much inventory do I carry? How long is my supply chain? How robust are my suppliers? These are the kinds of risks that companies were underestimating, and it's now become quite apparent. The other thing I'd build on Amy's comment, the reliability and resilience of the electric grid is more obvious than it has ever been. We always take that for granted, but when we're all sitting here at home and we depend on that, it used to be, if power went out in my neighborhood for a few hours, that wasn't a big deal. And the importance of the local utilities and being able to provide safe, reliable, resilient power to everybody is more important than ever. And I think investing in that kind of infrastructure makes a big difference as we go forward.
And that infrastructure is going to promote renewable energy and distributed energy, so smaller scale energy that can be repaired quickly. After these big events like Hurricane Sandy and so forth, and even Hurricane Harvey in Houston, these mini grids that companies had put in the grocery stores in Houston or some of the greener communities around New York City, they bounce back from these extreme weather events much more quickly than the centralized grid. So I think you're going to see that this could be very renewables promoting, and that's going to be a good thing. And then people are going to want to rely on new technologies. People ask me all the time about the future of fossil fuels, and I have this thing I used to do as like a parlor trick. I would hold up my smartphone and I would say, how many of you would turn in your smartphone if I told you I could give you a landline and you get the same services for $25 a month, and then I'll put we're going to put payphones back on the corner. How many of you would take that deal? And of course, no one would take that deal because you're walking around with a computer in your hand and you're really not willing to give that computer up. You're watching television on the train, whatever. So my point to you is with some of these renewable and distributed electricity technologies that are coming down the road, they're just going to be a superior technology. And the idea that somehow it's more expensive or, the fossil fuel industry likes to talk to you about scale and efficiency, like none of that's going to matter. I don't care that it's less efficient to have my telephone in my hand and have it serve as a computer and pay a wireless bill compared to what might have been my wired phone. It doesn't matter because it's a superior technology. And that's, I think, where we're headed with digital and electricity. And it's going to be important.
And there's a more positive story for climate on the electricity side of the energy market than on the liquid transportation fuels. It's harder to, solar and wind have displaced coal. It's harder on the transportation side. Several countries and even a couple of automakers have signaled the end of cars that run on gasoline. That idea is dead on arrival in Washington, D.C. right now. But California State Assemblyman member Bill Ting introduced a bill that would allow only zero-emission passenger vehicles to be registered in the state starting in 2040. That bill didn't go very far, and Ting pulled it when opposition arose from some surprising places.
The basic idea is if you want clean air, you need clean cars. And we've seen what would happen if we actually moved to clean cars today. Without having millions of cars on the road every day, we see for the first time in a long time, LA's got 3 weeks running of clean air. The Bay Area air quality is significantly better. We know what the solution is. We just haven't had the will or frankly some of the technology that's needed. I believe we need to set a deadline. It's like any assignment. If you have an assignment without a deadline, it never gets done. And so without having a deadline for when we need to transition to new clean cars completely, it's very difficult to signal to the industry how far along they should be, how many cars should they be selling. I voted for having that deadline by 2040. I had hoped that it would get further than it did. I had thought that with so many other countries already moving this direction, that us following other countries seemed to be common sense. England, France, India, Norway have already moved to that deadline or even more aggressively. I was surprised about how few environmental groups as well as electric vehicle groups did not embrace this notion of setting a deadline. Trump had gotten elected. Most environmental groups were very afraid of the rollbacks that have now occurred. They were worried about how California moving in a certain direction was going to hinder some of their work to hold the Obama gains together, which have now been lost. Since then, we've taken certain intermediate steps. I had a bill last year, AB 40, that also got held up, but we were able to put the point of the bill into the budget, which was to actually study how we get to clean cars by 2040. How many charging stations do we need? How many different types of cars do we need? If somebody wants to buy a truck and there's no clean option, they're still going to go buy a truck. As you or I know, the most profitable cars continue to be the biggest gas guzzlers, whether it's trucks, minivans, SUVs are the ones with the worst gas mileage but with the highest profit margins. So really, so many auto companies have been reticent to really move to clean cars.
State Assembly member Phil Ting. Matt Rogers, a lot in there, but what I heard him say was U.S. not leading on auto, the next era of the personal mobility and auto industry that's happening in other countries, and some surprising opponents to banning banning internal combustion engines. Your thought, Matt Rogers, on what Phil Ting just said?
Well, I think the most interesting thing to watch in electric mobility is China. China was before the crisis talking about 30 million electric vehicles coming out of China by 2030. That'd be 15 million for the domestic Chinese market and 15 million for the export markets. The world market is only 100 million vehicles a year. So this is about taking market share. And China believes that they can, as they've done in solar, that they can build electric vehicles better than anyone else in the world can, and that can be a new source of industrial profitability and growth for the country. And so people sort of look at what's going on in fuel emissions regulations and things like that. Look at China 2025. That's kind of the point at which the shift over in Chinese production would need to occur to achieve the 30 by 30 kind of idea. And that idea would change the global automobile industry in a very short period of time.
As we
Hey,
get
Greg,
close,
let me just jump in here with a quote from James A. Baker III, our former Secretary of State and former Secretary of Treasury. This is an article that ran today in Foreign Affairs. The winner of the emerging clean energy race will determine the economic and geopolitical balance of power for decades to come. And he argues that we are behind the times and we're letting China get the lead and we need to fix it. And I agree 200%.
I agree 300. Absolutely. China every day is laying miles of fast train tracks. We're doing nothing. Our infrastructure is crumbling while they're making a spanking brand new clean up to the minute transportation system that help run economies. What are we doing?
And so that really raises the question how we invest. Matt Rogers, there's been very little green infrastructure in the current recovery measures coming out of Congress, was very different than when you were involved in the Obama administration. There was a fair amount of clean energy in the stimulus, but it seems that these days there's not all the bets, all the money coming out of Washington is going toward fossils and legacy energy.
Yeah, we'll see what the next stimulus bill includes. Obviously, in the prior administration, we spent about $100 billion on clean energy. And importantly, in doing that, it was both about deploying existing clean energy technologies and then driving a rate of innovation that would put the U.S. ahead in a set of technologies. We ran 50 different battery technologies in different business models. And you take a look at the role that batteries are now beginning to play in the U.S. grid. Investments in innovation really matter in addition to investments in infrastructure. And I think if we can, as we look forward on stimulus, I think those will be markers about how healthy we are coming out.
Matt Rogers, there's also some questions about with oil so cheap, does that mean that the Canadian tar sands are uneconomic, that they stay in the ground for now? And also, you told me earlier that some of the companies that are going to go bust in the Permian Basin in Texas and elsewhere, they're the highest debt and also the highest emissions. So that might be a good thing for climate if some of the companies that go away are the dirtiest.
Well, I think it is interesting, and in the Permian Basin, 40% of the producers, 40% of the volume produced in the Permian Basin was produced by junk debt companies, and they had on average 5 times the emissions of the more creditworthy parties. So they were low quality from a financial standpoint and low quality from a operational standpoint. I think one of the key things is as the financial markets do their Darwinian thing and take out a set of poor credits. What's interesting is the remaining operators are actually much cleaner, much more reliable, much safer, and I think that will, could be a long-term benefit in terms of production.
Amy, Jaffe, you're involved in the Women in Energy Initiative at Columbia University, and there's been a report recently by CNN that countries led by women have been responding to the coronavirus have been the ones that have bent the curve most successfully. Your thoughts on Taiwan, New Zealand, Germany? Looking around, the countries that have responded best to COVID are run by women, led by women.
Well, women are underrated leaders. One of the interesting things is this academic studies show that corporations, and I'm sure it's the same thing for government, that have a certain percentage of women on their board of directors or in their C-suites perform better than companies that don't. And one of the things that determines that has to do both with innovation, tend to be more innovative, more creative, and also less apt to take failed, risky strategies, sort of Enron-like strategies. But the other study that shows, which is just really a terrible thing, is that companies who elect a woman chairman run the risk that investors will reject that company for a period of time when the woman is first in tenure. So we still have a lot of unconscious bias that is holding us back from the contribution that women in leadership roles can really provide key advantages. And some of that advantage is not just women versus men. It has to do with diversity in general, whether that's diverse backgrounds, people of different colors, people who have grown up under different socioeconomic means. We really want to do what we really have found in the studies at Columbia, brilliant professor named Catherine Phillips, is that working groups of professionals that have more diverse backgrounds, it takes them longer to come up with a consensus decision, but they are right 80% of the time, as opposed to a group where it is homogeneous, is only right like 30% of the time. And so it's really important to take advantage of the diversity we have here in the United States, both on gender and more broadly. And we really lose the opportunity to have better solutions and better leadership when we exclude groups.
As we get to the end, I want to think of big ideas. Kathleen Day, sometimes crises generate big, ambitious plans and ideas. What were some of the bold ideas, if you were to have, based on your studies of economic crises, what are some big ideas America ought to be thinking about as it tries to get through this COVID crisis?
Well, I know no one wants to talk about financial oversight and regulation, but I think it's not a new idea that comes out occasionally. It's one that people rediscover after every crisis because they forget it a few years after every crisis. And that is starting with the founding fathers. One thing that Jefferson and Hamilton agreed on, even though they disagreed on whether we should have a proliferation of banking, they agreed that if you do have it, you need to have oversight. People forget that being a corporation is a designation that a government gives you on behalf of society and people. And as part of getting that designation, being a corporation and having limited liability for your shareholders, so you can raise more money, part of that obliges the government, gives an obligation to the government to go in and make sure that that corporation isn't doing things that are harmful for society. So I wish people would remember that corporations, in particular in the financial sector, which are both corporations and they have other benefits from taxpayers, they need oversight, common sense oversight. And we abandon that a few years after every crisis.
Matt Rogers, big idea coming out of COVID to address climate and the economy.
Massive investment in climate resiliency and in cleaner technologies. Now is the perfect time to actually make those investments. We've shifted the curve down, and we now have the opportunity to lock in those gains and extend those gains and really take the next big risk off the table.
Amy Jaffe, last word, big idea that America ought to be thinking about at this time.
Digital revolution. We need to be investing every dollar we have on the recovery in training people to enter the digital economy, looking at the digital opportunities to reduce emissions, looking at how we move forward with these technologies that we're currently using to cope with this crisis, whether it's 3D printing. We're doing this show over social media and digital, like how to tap these new capabilities we have in a way that makes our economy strong and resilient globally and keeps us safe.
Thank you all. I'd like to give a shout out to the Climate One crew and team making this happen from their homes using new tools. On Climate One today, we've been discussing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy and transition away from fossil fuels. We heard that some of the dirtiest oil and gas companies have the worst credit rating and are likely to go bust in this recession. We also learned how the 1918 Spanish flu was linked to the economic crash of 1929 and how World War I helped gasoline beat out electricity as the fuel of choice in the fledgling auto industry. I'm Greg Dalton, and my guests today were Amy Jaffe, Director of the Program on Energy Security and Climate Change at the Council on Foreign Relations and an energy markets expert; Kathleen Day, Finance Lecturer at Johns Hopkins University and author of Broken Bargain, Banks, Bailouts, and the Struggle to Tame Wall Street; and Matt Rogers, a Senior Partner at McKinsey Company and co-author of the report, Addressing Climate in a Post-Pandemic World. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Please help us get us more people talking about climate change by giving us a rating or review. It really does help. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time here. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you all. That was fabulous.